"Ma'am, if you have nothing to hide, this will go quickly." The words cut through the low hum of the gas station like a blade that didn't need to be sharp to do damage, and for a second, everything else seemed to pause. The flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights, the slow drip of gasoline from an unattended nozzle, the faint buzz of a passing pickup truck easing off the highway. Naomi Carter stood beside pump number 4, her hands resting calmly on the cool metal surface of her car, her posture straight but unthreatening, as if she had already decided not to match the tension rising around her. Officer Ryan Walker adjusted his stance, one hand near his belt, the other hovering just enough to signal control without saying it out loud, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for something that would justify the certainty already sitting in his chest. A couple near the convenience store entrance slowed their steps, their conversation dissolving into silence as they watched, phones subtly lifting, not yet recording but close enough to it. Naomi's gaze shifted briefly, not to the officer, but to a young boy standing behind his mother near the ice machine, his small hands gripping the edge of her coat, eyes wide in that quiet way children get when they sense something isn't right but don't have the words for it. She offered him the smallest smile, the kind that didn't reach for attention, just steadied the air for a second, and then she looked back at Walker. "I already showed you my ID," she said, her voice even, measured, not defensive, just clear. Walker exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath that carried impatience more than effort. "And I told you, you matched the description," he replied, nodding slightly as if repeating it made it more true, his radio crackling faintly at his shoulder with distant, fragmented chatter that didn't quite land. The smell of gasoline hung sharp in the air, mixing with the faint scent of hot asphalt, and somewhere behind them, the automatic door of the store slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, then shut again, sealing in the moment like it belonged there. Naomi didn't move, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She just shifted her weight slightly, the sole of her shoe scraping lightly against the concrete, a quiet sound that somehow echoed louder than it should have. "You're making a mistake," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, like pointing out rain before it fell. Walker's jaw tightened, just enough to be visible if you were looking for it, and he glanced over his shoulder as another patrol car rolled in, its tires crunching softly over gravel near the edge of the lot. The second officer stepped out, slower, less certain, her eyes moving from Walker to Naomi and back again, taking in the scene without immediately choosing a side. "What's the situation?" she asked, her tone low, controlled, but carrying a question beneath it. Walker didn't hesitate. "Possible suspect. Matching description from earlier call," he said, his voice firm, clipped, like he had already closed the case in his head. The second officer's eyes lingered on Naomi for a moment longer than expected, not seeing danger, not seeing urgency, just seeing a woman standing still under harsh white light, her wrists relaxed at her sides, her expression composed in a way that didn't fit the narrative being built around her. "She doesn't look," she started, then stopped herself, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could fully form. Walker didn't wait for her to finish. "They never do," he said, quieter now, but heavier, the words settling into the space between them like something that had been said too many times before. Naomi's eyes flickered for just a second at that. Not anger, not fear, just recognition, like she had heard that line in different voices, in different places, over years that didn't need to be counted. The overhead light above them buzzed again, a faint electrical hum that seemed to pulse with the moment, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly before fading away, reminding everyone that this wasn't the only story unfolding tonight. Naomi glanced once more toward the boy by the ice machine, who hadn't moved, his grip still tight, his eyes still fixed on her, and she softened her expression again, just enough to steady him. "It's okay," she said gently, not loud, not performative, just enough for him to hear, and for a split second, the tension around them shifted, like the scene didn't quite know how to hold both fear and calm at the same time. Walker noticed it too, though he couldn't name it, couldn't place why it bothered him, only that it did. He reached for his radio then, pressing the button with a controlled firmness. "Dispatch, run ID again." "Full verification," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a thread of something else now, something thinner, less certain than before. The radio crackled back, static first, then a voice that sounded almost too careful. "Copy that, standby." The words hung there, suspended, and for a moment, no one moved. The drip of gasoline continued, slow, rhythmic, marking time in a way no clock could, and Naomi stood exactly where she was, not resisting, not retreating, her presence quiet but unshaken, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere beyond the reach of flashing lights and raised voices, and all that remained was for everyone else to catch up to it. The radio did not answer right away, and that delay, that thin stretch of silence, pressed heavier than any raised voice could have as Officer Ryan Walker kept his finger near the button, his gaze fixed ahead but not quite steady anymore, while Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, the overhead light casting a pale wash across her face, flattening shadows, making everything feel sharper and colder at the same time as the second officer shifted her weight and glanced toward the patrol car. Then back at Walker, sensing something she could not yet name as the faint hum of the fluorescent fixture above them grew louder in the quiet, like it was filling the gap left by the missing response. A pickup truck slowed as it passed the entrance to the station, the driver turning his head just enough to take in the scene before continuing on, tires rolling over the asphalt with a low, steady sound that faded too quickly, leaving the moment intact and untouched as if the outside world had chosen not to interfere. Naomi's hands remained relaxed, her fingers slightly curled, not tense, not rigid, just present, and when she exhaled, it was slow and controlled, the kind of breath that suggested practice, not panic, as if she understood something about this moment that no one else did yet. Walker cleared his throat quietly, the sound barely audible, but enough to break his own stillness as he pressed the radio again. "Dispatch, confirm status," he said, this time with a touch more insistence, his voice still even but edged now with expectation as the response came through, softer than before, almost cautious. "Stand by, Officer Walker, verifying now." The words were careful, too careful, and Walker's brow tightened slightly as he shifted his stance, his boot scraping lightly against the concrete, the sound small but sharp in the quiet. The second officer stepped a little closer, lowering her voice. "Do you want me to run it through the mobile system?" she asked, her tone neutral but her eyes searching his face for something that felt less certain than it had a minute ago. Walker shook his head once, quick, controlled. "Dispatch has it," he replied, though the confidence in his voice did not land the same way it had earlier as Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to register the shift in the air, the subtle change in rhythm that happens when authority starts to hesitate. The child by the ice machine had not moved, his mother now crouched slightly beside him, whispering something meant to soothe, but her own eyes kept drifting back toward Naomi, toward the stillness that did not match the situation, toward the calm that felt almost out of place under the harsh light and the quiet tension. A breeze moved through the lot, carrying with it the faint scent of diesel from a nearby pump, rustling a loose receipt near the curb that skittered across the ground in uneven bursts before catching against the edge of a parking block and stopping, as if even that small motion had reached its limit. Walker glanced briefly at Naomi's car, then back at her, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion now, but in something closer to confusion, as if the pieces he had arranged in his mind no longer fit together the way they had moments ago. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, the question coming out more as a formality than an accusation, his tone flattening as he spoke. Naomi met his gaze without challenge, without avoidance. "Home," she said simply, her voice steady, grounded, the single word carrying no extra weight, no attempt to persuade, just truth offered without decoration. Walker nodded once, almost reflexively, then looked away for a second, his jaw tightening as the radio crackled again, louder this time, the static. Sharper, cutting through the quiet like a signal that had finally decided to arrive. "Officer Walker." The voice came through, clearer now, but carrying a tension that had not been there before. "We are still confirming. Do not proceed further at this time." The instruction hung in the air, unexpected, precise, and for a moment, Walker did not respond, his hands still near the radio, his posture caught between action and pause as the second officer's eyes widened slightly, just enough to show that she had heard it the same way he had. Naomi did not react outwardly, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle release, not relief, but recognition, as if the moment had just crossed an invisible line that only she had been able to see coming. Walker finally pressed the button again. "Copy," he said, the words short, controlled, but lacking the certainty that had defined him earlier as he lowered his hand slowly, his gaze drifting once more toward Naomi, then toward the far edge of the lot where the road met the darkness beyond the station lights, his eyes lingering there a second longer than necessary, as if he expected something to appear, something that would explain the hesitation now threading through every part of this scene. The fluorescent light buzzed again overhead, the sound steady, unchanging, and yet everything beneath it felt different, like the ground itself had shifted slightly underfoot, just enough to be felt, not enough to be seen, and Naomi stood in that space without moving, without pushing, her presence quiet but unyielding, as the moment stretched, waiting for whatever was about to arrive next. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like pressure building beneath something no one could see, as Officer Ryan Walker kept his eyes toward the edge of the lot, his attention pulled by nothing visible, just a feeling that had begun to settle into his chest, heavy and unfamiliar, while the second officer followed his gaze, her posture tightening slightly, as if she sensed it too, the kind of awareness that does not come from instruction, but from instinct. Naomi Carter remained still, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged even as the air around her began to move differently, like the moment had tilted just enough to alter its direction as a low rumble rolled in. From the distance, not loud, not urgent, just there, growing slowly, like something approaching without the need to announce itself. The child by the ice machine turned his head first, his eyes shifting past Naomi, past the officers, toward the road, and his mother followed a second later, her expression tightening as she straightened slightly, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder while the rumble grew clearer, resolving into the smooth, controlled sound of engines moving with purpose, not speed. Walker's jaw set as he finally turned his head fully toward the road, his eyes narrowing as a dark SUV came into view, followed by another, both vehicles clean, unmarked, their windows tinted just enough to hide details, but not in tint as they slowed before entering the lot, their movement precise, deliberate, like they belonged exactly where they were going before they even arrived. No sirens, no flashing lights, just presence. The tires rolled over the asphalt with a soft, controlled sound as the first SUV turned in, followed closely by the second, both coming to a smooth stop near the edge of the station, not blocking, not rushing, just positioning as if they understood the space better than anyone already standing in it. The engine noise settled into a quiet idle, steady and contained, and for a moment, no one moved. The fluorescent light above Naomi buzzed again, unchanged, indifferent, while everything beneath it felt like it had shifted into something else entirely. Walker's hand hovered near his radio again, but he did not press it, not yet. His eyes fixed on the vehicles as the driver's side door of the first SUV opened with a controlled, almost quiet motion and a man stepped out, his posture straight, his movements efficient without being hurried, dressed in a dark suit that caught the light just enough to reveal its sharp lines without drawing attention to itself. He did not look around immediately. He looked forward. Then he looked at Naomi. The second officer took a half step back without realizing it, her body reacting before her mind could catch up as the man closed the door behind him and began walking across the lot, each step measured, unforced, his shoes making soft contact with the concrete, steady, unhurried, like he was not entering the situation, but arriving at it. Walker shifted his stance again, this time more noticeably, his shoulders tightening as he straightened slightly, the automatic posture of someone recalibrating without wanting to admit it, while the radio on his shoulder crackled once more, louder now, sharper, cutting through the moment with urgency that had not been there before. "Officer Walker." The voice came through, no longer cautious, now precise, firm. "Units are en route to your location. Stand down and await further instruction." Walker blinked once, his grip tightening slightly near the radio, his eyes flicking from the approaching man to Naomi, then back again as if trying to connect something that had not yet been explained. Naomi did not move. She simply watched, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as the man in the suit closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away, not too close, not too far, his presence filling the space in a way that did not need to raise its voice to be felt. He glanced briefly at Walker, then at the second officer, his eyes sharp, assessing, not hostile, just certain, before returning to Naomi with a small, almost imperceptible nod, a recognition that did not need introduction. The second SUV remained still, its engine idling quietly, but the sense of it, the weight of it, sat behind the moment like a shadow that had not yet stepped forward. Walker finally pressed his radio. "Dispatch, I have additional units on scene," he said, his voice controlled, but no longer anchored the same way as before, the words sounding like they were catching up to something already in motion. The reply came immediately this time. "Copy that. Maintain position. Do not escalate." The instruction landed differently now, heavier, more final, and Walker lowered his hand slowly, his eyes returning to Naomi, as if seeing her for the first time, without the filter he had placed over her minutes ago, the certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, more human. Naomi met his gaze, not with triumph, not with anger, just with the same calm she had held from the beginning. The same stillness that now seemed less like passivity and more like control, as if she had never been waiting for this moment, only allowing it to arrive in its own time. The man in the suit did not rush to speak, and that pause, deliberate and controlled, settled over the scene with more authority than any raised voice could have. As he stood facing Naomi Carter, his posture straight, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady and precise like he already understood every detail that had unfolded before he arrived, while the soft hum of the idling SUVs behind him filled the edges of the moment, low and constant, like a heartbeat that did not belong to anyone present, but controlled everything anyway. Officer Ryan Walker shifted again, this time more noticeably, his weight moving from one foot to the other as if the ground beneath him had become uncertain, his eyes flicking between the man and Naomi, trying to measure something that no longer followed the rules he had relied on minutes earlier, while the second officer stood slightly behind him now, her arms no longer rigid, her stance no longer fixed, as if she had instinctively stepped out of the center of something that was no longer hers to control. The man finally spoke, his voice calm, even, but carrying a clarity that cut through the lingering tension without force. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful, measured, "are you all right?" The question landed softly, but its weight shifted the entire space as Naomi gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her voice steady when she answered. "I am," she said, simple, direct, without embellishment, and for a brief second, the air seemed to release something it had been holding. The man acknowledged her response with the slightest inclination of his head before turning his attention to Walker, not abruptly, not aggressively, just fully, as if redirecting a lens that had finally found its correct focus. "Officer," he said, his tone still controlled, but now carrying a firmness that left no room for misinterpretation. "Can you explain the basis for this detention?" The question did not accuse, it did not challenge openly, but it demanded clarity in a way that made avoidance impossible. Walker straightened instinctively, his shoulders tightening as he drew a breath that did not quite settle where it should have. "She matched a description from a call earlier," he replied, his voice steady on the surface, but thinner now, less anchored, as if the words were being tested even as he spoke them, while the fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied again, casting the same cold brightness over the scene that now felt entirely different. The man listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Walker in a way that did not intimidate, but did not yield either. "And what was the nature of that call?" he asked, his voice unchanged, each word placed with precision. Walker hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to be seen, enough to register as something new in a moment that had already begun to shift. "Suspicious activity," he said finally, the phrase sounding less certain now, like it had lost some of its weight along the way. The second officer glanced at him briefly, then looked away, her jaw tightening slightly as if she had heard the difference too. The man nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer without accepting it entirely. "And at this time," he continued, Do you have any evidence of wrongdoing? The question hung there, simple, direct, impossible to avoid, and Walker's eyes flickered toward Naomi again, then back to the man, his breath catching slightly before he answered. No, sir, he said. The words are coming out automatically, instinctively, without being asked for, as if something in him had already adjusted to a hierarchy he had not yet fully understood. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled quietly, not with frustration, but with finality, as if a conclusion had just been reached. Then I would advise that you proceed accordingly, he said, his tone still calm, but now carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a suggestion. The radio on Walker's shoulder crackled again, louder, sharper, the voice on the other end no longer cautious, now firm, unmistakable. Officer Walker, release the individual immediately and stand down. The instruction landed like a line drawn across the moment, clear and unambiguous, and Walker's hand hovered near the cuffs, not moving at first, his eyes fixed ahead as if he needed a second longer to reconcile what had just happened with what he had believed minutes earlier, while Naomi stood still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not pressing, not reacting, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it was meant to. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, creating space without being told, her movements quiet, respectful, as if she understood that something larger than procedure had just taken control of the situation while the man in the suit remained where he was, his attention no longer shifting, his role now clear without needing to be stated. Walker finally moved, his fingers working carefully, deliberately, the small metallic sound of the cuffs releasing cutting through the quiet like a marker of change, not loud, but undeniable as Naomi brought her hands forward slowly, not rubbing her wrists, not reacting outwardly, just lowering them to her sides again, her composure intact, her expression unchanged. The air seemed to settle around them, but it was not the same air as before. It carried something different now, something quieter, heavier, like the aftermath of a realization that had not yet fully taken shape as Walker stepped back half a step, his posture no longer squared, his presence no longer certain, his eyes unable to hold Naomi's for more than a second at a time, while the fluorescent light above continued its steady hum, unchanged, indifferent, as if it had seen moments like this before and knew exactly how they ended, long before anyone else did. The metallic click of the cuffs releasing did not echo for long, but the absence of that sound lingered, stretching into the quiet like something that had just been undone, could not be easily forgotten, as Naomi Carter lowered her hands fully to her sides, her fingers uncurling slowly, naturally, without urgency, as if the moment had never belonged to the restraint in the first place, while Officer Ryan Walker stepped back another half step, the movement small but unmistakable, his posture no longer squared, his shoulders no longer fixed in that rigid line of authority he had carried earlier, as his eyes dropped briefly to the ground, then lifted again, searching for something that was no longer there. The man in the suit remained still, his presence steady, his gaze shifting only slightly as he observed the change in the scene, not interfering, not guiding, simply allowing the outcome to settle into place as the low hum of the SUVs continued behind him, constant, controlled, like a reminder that the moment had layers far beyond what had first appeared. The second officer exhaled quietly, almost unnoticed, her stance softening further as she moved one step to the side, giving Naomi space not because she was told to, but because it felt necessary now, because the balance of the scene had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Naomi did not move immediately. She did not step away, did not rush toward her car. She simply stood there for a second longer, letting the air settle, letting the weight of what had just happened pass through without resistance as the fluorescent light above continued its faint buzz, steady and indifferent, illuminating everything equally, without judgment. Walker cleared his throat again, but this time the sound felt different, not an attempt to assert control, but something closer to grounding himself as he glanced toward Naomi, his gaze hesitant now, uncertain, like he was trying to find the right place to stand in a moment that had already moved past him. "Ma'am," he began, the word coming slower this time, more careful, as if he was aware of how it sounded. "You are free to go." The sentence was simple, procedural, but it did not carry the same weight it usually did, It felt smaller, quieter, like it arrived too late to matter in the way it was meant to. Naomi met his gaze for a brief second, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm, not distant, not cold, just steady. And then she gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without reacting to them, without giving them more meaning than they deserved. The man in the suit shifted his attention back to her, his posture still composed, his voice lower now, but still clear. "We can escort you, if you prefer," he said, the offer direct, respectful, without assumption as Naomi shook her head slightly. "That will not be necessary," she replied, her tone even, her words simple, carrying a quiet confidence that did not need reinforcement as she turned her body slightly toward her car, her movements unhurried, deliberate, each step measured as she reached for the driver's side door, her hand resting briefly on the handle before she paused, not because she hesitated, but because something in the moment had not fully settled yet. Behind her, Walker remained where he was, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, his radio quiet, his presence diminished in a way that did not come from instruction, but from realization as he watched her, not as a suspect, not as a problem to solve, but as a person he had misjudged without fully understanding why. The child near the ice machine leaned slightly forward, his eyes following Naomi's movement, the tension in his small frame easing just enough to be visible as his mother's hand relaxed on his shoulder, her grip loosening as the scene lost its edge. Naomi opened the car door slowly, the soft creak of the hinge cutting gently through the quiet as she placed one hand on the roof of the car, steadying herself not from weakness, but from intention, as if she was choosing how to leave, not simply leaving because she could. She turned her head slightly then, not fully, just enough to look back toward Walker, her gaze finding him without searching, holding there for a brief moment that felt longer than it was as the fluorescent light reflected faintly in her eyes, steady, unbroken. She did not speak. She did not need to. The look itself carried something quieter than anger, deeper than frustration, something that settled into the space between them without force, without accusation, but impossible to ignore. Walker felt it, even if he could not name it, even if he did not yet understand it as his jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in recognition, like a piece of something inside him had just shifted, small, but permanent. Naomi turned back, lowering herself into the driver's seat with the same calm she had held from the beginning, her movements smooth, controlled, as she reached for the door and pulled it closed, the sound soft, final, sealing the moment behind her as the engine started with a quiet hum, blending with the low idle of the SUVs behind her, the two sounds existing side by side without conflict. Walker stood there, watching, his posture still, his hands unmoving. As Naomi adjusted the mirror briefly, her reflection catching for a second before she shifted it away, focusing forward instead as the car eased into motion, rolling slowly out of the space, past the pump, past the edge of the light, toward the darker stretch of road beyond. The fluorescent light continued to buzz above, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, but the silence left behind was different now, heavier, quieter, carrying something that would not fade as quickly as the sound of her car disappearing into the night. The red glow of Naomi Carter's taillights faded slowly into the darkness beyond the edge of the gas station, swallowed by the long stretch of road that curved gently past a row of silent trees. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the scene itself needed time to understand what had just passed through it, while the fluorescent light above continued its steady hum, indifferent, casting the same pale brightness over a space that no longer felt the same. Officer Ryan Walker remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on the empty road long after the car had disappeared, his posture still, but not firm, not anchored, just held in place by something quieter than duty, something heavier than confusion as his hands rested loosely at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if they had forgotten what they were supposed to do next. The second officer shifted her weight again, glancing briefly toward him, then toward the man in the suit, her expression measured, thoughtful, as if she was piecing together the moment from a different angle now, one that did not rely on assumption or instinct, but on what she had actually seen. The man in the suit turned slightly, his attention moving away from the road and back toward Walker, his presence unchanged, steady, composed, like he had already reached the end of this moment long before anyone else had. "Officer," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying no urgency, no irritation, just clarity. "This interaction will be documented." The statement was not a threat, not a warning. It was simply a fact, delivered without weight, but landing heavily anyway as Walker blinked once, his jaw tightening slightly, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement, like the words had found their place before he could prepare for them. "Yes, sir," he replied, the response automatic, but quieter than before, less certain, as if something in him had shifted out of alignment. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition, before turning back toward the SUV, his movements as controlled as when he arrived, his shoes making soft contact with the pavement as he walked away, without haste, without looking back. The second officer watched him go, then glanced at Walker again, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something, then closing again as she chose silence instead, the kind of silence that carries more than words when there are no simple ones to offer. The door of the SUV closed with a muted sound, followed by the low shift of the engine as it prepared to move, the second vehicle behind it mirroring the motion as both SUVs eased forward, their headlights cutting briefly across the lot before turning toward the road, their departure as quiet and deliberate as their arrival, leaving no trace but the absence of what had been there. The hum of their engines faded quickly, replaced again by the familiar sounds of the station, the distant highway noise, the soft buzz of the lights, the quiet movement of air across open space, and yet none of it felt the same anymore. Walker exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if something had just been released, though not completely. Not enough to feel like relief as he reached up and adjusted his radio. Not because it needed it, but because he needed something to do, something to anchor himself in a moment that no longer made sense the way it had before. "You good?" the second officer asked finally, her voice low, not probing, not judgmental, just present as Walker nodded once, though the movement felt delayed, like his body had to catch up to the question. "Yeah," he said, the word short, but lacking weight, as if it did not fully belong to him yet. She studied him for a second, then looked away, her gaze moving toward the empty space where Naomi's car had been, her expression thoughtful, quiet, as if she was holding on to something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Near the ice machine, the child shifted again, stepping slightly out from behind his mother now, his grip loosened, his eyes no longer wide, but curious, watching the officers not with fear, but with a kind of quiet observation that felt older than he was while his mother straightened, smoothing her coat unconsciously, her gaze moving briefly toward Walker, then away, as if the moment had already settled into something she would carry with her long after she left. Walker noticed it, that look, brief as it was, and something in his chest tightened, not sharply, not suddenly, but enough to register, enough to stay as he turned slightly, his eyes scanning the lot, the pumps, the empty spaces, everything exactly where it had been, and yet nothing quite the same. The receipt that had been caught near the curb earlier lifted again with a small gust of wind, fluttering once before settling back down, its edges worn, its ink faded, like something that had been used and forgotten, and Walker's gaze lingered on it for a second longer than necessary before he looked away, his jaw tightening again, not in defense this time, but in thought. He took a step back, then another, moving toward the patrol car slowly, his movements no longer sharp, no longer automatic, each step measured, as if he was aware of them in a way he had not been before, while the fluorescent light continued its steady hum above, unchanged, illuminating a space that had already moved on, even if the people in it had not yet caught up. And as he reached for the door handle of his car, his hand paused for just a fraction of a second, hovering there, not because he forgot what to do, but because for the first time that night, he was not entirely sure why he had done what he did, and that uncertainty settled into him quietly, without force, without demand, but with a weight that would not leave as easily as the sound of Naomi's car disappearing into the night. The patrol car door did not open right away, and that hesitation, small and almost invisible, lingered longer than it should have as Officer Ryan Walker kept his hand resting on the handle, his fingers still, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the reflection in the glass, where the faint outline of his own face stared back at him under the pale wash of the station lights, while the low hum of the fluorescent fixture above seemed louder now, sharper, like it was filling a space that had been left behind by something he could not quite name. He finally pulled the door open, the hinge giving a soft, familiar creak, and slid into the driver's seat with a controlled motion, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate, as if each action required thought, where before it had been automatic. As the interior of the car greeted him with the faint scent of vinyl and paper, the quiet ticking of the cooling engine blending with the distant noise of the highway. He did not start the car immediately. Instead, he sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze drifting toward the windshield where the empty stretch of road remained, unchanged, silent, holding no answers. The second officer approached slowly, her footsteps soft against the pavement, stopping just outside his window as she leaned slightly down, her expression neutral but attentive. "You heading back?" she asked, her tone calm, not pushing, just present as Walker nodded once, though his eyes did not fully meet hers. "Yeah," he said, the word quieter than expected, carrying less certainty than it should have while she studied him for a second, then gave a small nod of her own. "I will finish up here," she added, straightening again, her gaze moving briefly across the lot before returning to him. Walker nodded again, then reached for the ignition, turning the key slowly as the engine came to life with a low, steady rumble, the vibration traveling through the frame of the car and into his hands, grounding him in something real, something physical as he exhaled softly, adjusting his grip on the wheel. The headlights cut across the pavement ahead, illuminating the pump, the empty spaces, the edge of the lot where darkness began, and for a moment, he just sat there, watching the light settle into place, as if waiting for it to reveal something more than it could. He shifted the car into drive, the gear engaging with a faint click, and eased forward slowly, rolling past the pump where Naomi Carter had stood only minutes before, the memory of her presence still lingering in the space, even though nothing remained to show it as his eyes flicked briefly to that spot, then back to the road ahead, his jaw tightening slightly, not in frustration, but in thought. As he reached the edge of the lot, he paused again, the car idling quietly as he looked out toward the road, the same stretch of asphalt that had swallowed her car moments earlier, now empty, silent, offering no trace of where it led or what it held as a car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly sweeping across the scene before fading away, leaving the darkness intact. Walker pulled onto the road, the tires making a soft transition from the rough edge of the lot to the smoother asphalt, and began to drive, the engine steady, the motion smooth, the familiar rhythm of the road unfolding beneath him mile by mile as the streetlights passed overhead at regular intervals, casting brief pools of light that flickered across the dashboard, across his hands, across his face, each one revealing and then hiding the same expression that had not yet settled. His grip on the wheel tightened slightly, then loosened, his fingers adjusting unconsciously as his mind replayed the moment in fragments, not in order, not in clarity, just pieces, the sound of his own voice, the look in Naomi's eyes, the silence that followed when everything shifted as he swallowed once, his throat dry, his breathing steady but shallow. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking through the quiet of the car, and Walker reached up instinctively, pressing the button. "Walker," he said, his voice returning to its practiced tone, controlled, even as the reply came through immediately, sharper than usual. "Report back to the station. Now." The instruction was brief, direct, leaving no room for interpretation as Walker blinked once, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Copy," he replied, releasing the button as the radio fell silent again, the weight of the command settling into the car with him as he adjusted his course slightly, the turn subtle but intentional, redirecting toward the station. The road ahead stretched long and straight, the lines on the pavement passing beneath him in steady rhythm. And yet the drive did not feel routine. It did not feel familiar as something in him had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the way the night settled around him. He passed a small strip mall, its lights dimmed, its windows dark, a single neon sign flickering faintly in the distance as he continued on, the city thinning out around him, the buildings giving way to longer stretches of open road, quieter spaces where the hum of the engine became the loudest thing inside the car. His reflection caught briefly in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting it for a second before he looked away, his jaw tightening again, not in anger, but in recognition, like he was seeing something he had not noticed before. As the memory of Naomi standing under that harsh light returned, steady, unshaken, her silence louder than anything he had said. He adjusted the mirror slightly, the motion small, almost absent, and focused back on the road ahead, the station lights now faintly visible in the distance, glowing softly against the dark sky as he pressed the accelerator just a little more, the car responding smoothly, carrying him forward into a place where answers would not come easily, and where the weight of what had just happened would not stay behind as easily as he might have hoped. The station lights came into view long before Officer Ryan Walker reached the building, glowing pale against the night sky like something steady, something unchanging. And yet as he drove closer, the familiarity of it did not settle the way it usually did. It did not bring the quiet sense of routine he had relied on for years. Instead, it felt distant, almost unfamiliar, like he was approaching a place he had never fully seen before. As his car rolled into the parking lot with a soft crunch of gravel under the tires, the engine humming low before he eased into a space near the entrance and shifted into park, the click of the gear louder than it should have been in the stillness of the moment. He sat there for a second, hands still on the steering wheel, the dashboard lights casting a faint glow across his fingers, highlighting the subtle tension in the way they rested there. As he exhaled slowly, then reached for the door, pushing it open and stepping out into the cool night air, the scent of asphalt and distant exhaust settling around him as the door closed behind him with a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo just a little too long. The building stood ahead, its glass doors reflecting the overhead lights, the inside visible but muted, shapes moving behind the surface without detail. As Walker adjusted his uniform unconsciously, smoothing the front of his shirt, straightening the line of his collar, small movements meant to restore something that had shifted out of place earlier that night. He walked toward the entrance, his steps measured, steady, but not as automatic as they had been at the start of his shift, each footfall landing with quiet intention. As he reached for the door and pulled it open, the interior air warmer, carrying the faint scent of coffee and paper, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the distant murmur of voices. The front desk officer looked up briefly, offering a nod that Walker returned without slowing, his attention already moving past the lobby, down the hallway where the familiar layout stretched out in clean lines, offices on either side, doors partially open, lights spilling into the corridor in soft rectangles. A few officers stood near the far end, their conversation low, but it paused as Walker approached, their eyes following him for just a second longer than usual before returning to their own space. The shift subtle, but present. Walker felt it, even if he did not turn to acknowledge it, even if he did not fully understand why it was there. He continued down the hall until he reached the briefing room, the door already open, the light inside brighter, sharper, revealing the long table at the center and the figures gathered around it. As he stepped inside, the room quieting almost immediately, the low conversation cutting off mid-sentence as heads turned toward him, the weight of their attention settling into the space before he had a chance to speak. At the far end of the table stood a senior officer, his posture straight, his expression controlled, his eyes fixed on Walker with a focus that did not leave room for misinterpretation. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm, but firm, the instruction clear. Walker turned, reaching back to push the door shut, the soft click of the latch sealing the room, cutting off the hallway noise, leaving only the quiet hum of the lights and the presence of the people inside. He stepped forward, stopping near the end of the table, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his posture straight, though not rigid, not defensive, just held in place. As the senior officer studied him for a moment, the silence stretching just long enough to be felt before he spoke again. "Walk me through what happened," he said, his tone even, but carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a casual request. Walker drew a breath, the air catching slightly before settling as he began to speak, his voice steady at first, recounting the sequence of events, the call, the description, the stop, the interaction, each detail laid out in order, clean, procedural, the way it had been taught, the way it had always been done as the room remained quiet, the officers around the table listening without interruption, their expressions neutral, but attentive. As he spoke, the memory replayed in his mind, not as it had felt in the moment, but as it sounded now, the words, the tone, the pauses, each piece falling into place in a way that felt different from before, less certain, more exposed as he reached the part where the SUVs arrived, where the man stepped out, where the radio changed, his voice slowing slightly, just enough to be noticed. The senior officer did not move, did not react outwardly, but his eyes remained fixed, steady, taking in every word, every shift in tone, every hesitation as Walker finished, the final words settling into the room, leaving a silence behind them that felt heavier than the one before. The senior officer nodded once, slowly, then placed both hands on the table, leaning forward just enough to close the distance between them. "Do you know who that woman is?" he asked, his voice lower now, but sharper, the question precise, cutting through the remaining space without effort. Walker hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flickering briefly, then returning. "No, sir," he answered, the truth simple, direct, but carrying something else now, something that had not been there earlier. The senior officer held his gaze for a moment longer, then straightened slightly, his expression unchanged, but his presence heavier, more defined as the room remained still, waiting, holding its breath for what came next while Walker stood there. The memory of Naomi's calm, her silence, her steady gaze under that cold light rising again, clearer now, sharper, as if the question had just pulled it fully into focus. The question did not leave the room when it was spoken. It stayed there, suspended in the air between them, pressing quietly against every surface as Officer Ryan Walker felt it settle deeper than expected, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they carried as he stood still, his posture unchanged, but something beneath it shifting, something subtle, something he could not push aside the way he had pushed aside doubt before. The senior officer did not repeat himself, did not raise his voice. He simply watched, his gaze steady, patient, like he already understood the answer before it was given, while the hum of the fluorescent lights above filled the silence, steady and indifferent, casting the same even glow across the table, across the faces in the room, across Walker's hands where his fingers now rested slightly tighter than before. "No, sir," Walker had said, and now the truth of it lingered, not just as a fact, but as a gap, something missing that should have been there, something he should have known, or at least questioned, but had not. The senior officer exhaled slowly, his breath measured, controlled, as he straightened fully, his hands leaving the table as he stepped to the side, moving toward a small monitor mounted on the wall, its screen dark until he reached for the control panel and pressed a single button, bringing it to life with a soft flicker that illuminated the room with a slightly colder light. The screen filled with a still image first, sharp, clear, unmistakable, and for a moment, no one spoke as the photograph settled into view, showing Naomi Carter standing in a different setting, dressed formally, her posture the same, her expression composed, her presence steady in a way that now felt familiar but had been overlooked before. Walker's eyes fixed on the image, his focus narrowing, his breath catching slightly as recognition began to form, not of who she was, but of what he had missed. The senior officer spoke again, his voice lower now, but carrying more weight than before. "That is Naomi Carter," he said, pausing just long enough for the name to settle, to connect, to mean something more than it had minutes ago as Walker's jaw tightened slightly, the name repeating in his mind, fitting into place with the memory of her voice, her calm, her steady gaze under the harsh light of the gas station. The senior officer continued, his tone unchanged, but the room felt different now, heavier, more focused. "She is the spouse of General Marcus Carter," he said, each word deliberate, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation as a quiet shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, just present, like a collective understanding settling into place among the officers standing around the table. Walker did not move, his eyes still on the screen, his mind working through the information, aligning it with the moment he had just lived, the commands on the radio, the arrival of the SUVs, the presence of the man in the suit, Everything that had not made sense before now falling into a structure that felt undeniable. 4-star, the senior officer added, not as emphasis, but as completion, as if the detail itself carried its own weight without needing to be explained. Walker blinked once, slowly, the words landing fully now, not just as information, but as impact, as consequence, as something that reached back into the moment at the gas station and changed it entirely, reshaping every decision, every assumption, every word he had spoken. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, steady, unchanged, as if it had no awareness of what had just shifted in the room. But Walker felt it, not in the air, but in himself, a tightening in his chest, a quiet pressure that did not come from fear, but from realization. The senior officer turned slightly, his gaze returning to Walker, his expression controlled, but sharper now, more direct. Pentagon made contact within 5 minutes, he said, the statement simple, factual, but carrying a weight that did not need elaboration as Walker's eyes flickered briefly, the timeline aligning instantly, the delay on the radio, the hesitation, the shift in tone, everything clicking into place with a clarity that felt almost too late. Do you understand the gravity of this? The senior officer asked, his voice steady, but now unmistakably firm, the question not rhetorical, not open-ended, but precise, demanding recognition rather than explanation. Walker swallowed once, the motion small, but visible, his throat dry as he finally looked away from the screen, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, meeting the senior officer's eyes with something different now, something quieter, more grounded. Yes, sir, he said, his voice steady, but lower, the certainty in it no longer coming from authority, but from understanding, from the weight of what had just settled into place. The room remained still for a moment longer, the silence no longer empty, but full, carrying the aftermath of the revelation as the image on the screen remained unchanged. Naomi Carter's calm expression fixed in place, her presence steady even in stillness, a reflection of the same composure she had carried under the fluorescent lights of the gas station, the same quiet strength that had not needed to announce itself to be real. Walker felt it again, that moment, her gaze meeting his, not with anger, not with fear, just with a calm that now felt heavier than anything he had brought into that situation. And as he stood there, the weight of that realization did not rush, did not overwhelm. It settled slowly, firmly, like something that would stay, something that would not be easily set aside as the senior officer reached forward and turned off the monitor, the screen fading back to black, leaving the room in the same light as before, but not the same understanding as the silence returned, quieter now, deeper, holding everything that had just been revealed without needing to say another word. The screen went dark, but the image did not leave. It stayed behind the eyes, sharper now, clearer than when it had first appeared as Officer Ryan Walker stood there, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in the same way, the weight of the room pressing differently against him, not from authority, not from rank, but from understanding that had come too late to change what had already happened while the senior officer let the silence settle, not rushing to fill it, not softening it, allowing it to do what it needed to do. Walker's gaze drifted briefly to the table, the smooth surface reflecting the overhead lights in long pale streaks, and for a second, he saw not the room, but the gas station again, the same light, the same stillness, Naomi Carter standing there, unshaken, her voice calm, her words simple, and he felt it again, that moment where everything could have gone differently if he had just paused, if he had just listened. The senior officer moved back to the center of the room, his steps quiet, controlled, stopping across from Walker with a presence that did not need to raise itself to be felt. This is not about who she is, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the silence with clarity. It is about how you handled the situation before you knew. The words landed deeper than the revelation had, not because they were louder, but because they reached into something Walker had not yet fully faced as he lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the senior officer's eyes, not with defense, not with resistance, but with something quieter, something more open, like he was no longer trying to hold on to the version of himself from earlier that night. Walk me through your decision. The senior officer continued, his tone unchanged, but sharper now, more focused as Walker drew a breath, slower this time, more deliberate, his mind no longer replaying the events in fragments, but in sequence, clearer now, each step visible in a way it had not been before. I received a call, he began, his voice steady, but lower, more measured. Description was vague, location nearby. I saw her at the pump, match what I thought I heard, and he paused, not because he forgot, but because the next part felt different now, heavier as the room remained still, no one interrupting, no one shifting, just listening. I moved forward. He finished, the words simple, but lacking the certainty they once had. The senior officer watched him for a moment, then tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. You thought you heard. He repeated, not as a question, but as a reflection, letting the phrase sit there, letting it reveal itself for what it was as Walker's jaw tightened just slightly, not in defense, but in recognition, the gap between what he knew and what he assumed now clear, undeniable. Did you confirm? The senior officer asked, his voice calm, but precise, each word placed carefully as Walker shook his head once, slow, controlled. No, sir, he said, the admission quiet, but solid, not avoiding, not minimizing, just stating. The room seemed to narrow slightly around that answer, not closing in, but focusing, drawing everything toward that single point as the senior officer nodded once, slowly. And when she told you that you were making a mistake? He continued, his tone still even, but carrying a different weight now as Walker's eyes flickered briefly, the memory of her voice returning, steady, unshaken. I did not adjust, he said, the words coming without hesitation this time, not because they were easy, but because they were true. The senior officer held his gaze, then stepped back slightly, creating space, not to distance himself, but to let the moment breathe. That is where this changes, he said, his voice lower now, but more direct, because authority is not tested when everything is clear, it is tested when it is not. The statement settled into the room, not as instruction, not as correction, but as something deeper, something that did not need to be repeated to be understood as Walker felt it land, not just in the moment, but somewhere further back, somewhere quieter, where decisions were made before they became actions. He nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, in understanding that had finally reached him as the senior officer turned slightly, his attention moving briefly to the other officers in the room, then back again. You will file a full report, he said, the words procedural, but carrying more weight now. Every detail, no omissions. Walker nodded again. Yes, sir, he replied, his voice steady, but different, grounded in something that had not been there before. The senior officer studied him for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition of where the moment had landed before he stepped away, moving toward the door, his presence easing slightly as the room shifted with him, the tension not gone, but changed, settled into something quieter. Walker remained where he was for a second longer, his hands still at his sides, his gaze unfocused for just a moment as the memory of Naomi standing under that light returned again, clearer now, sharper, not because of who she was, but because of how she had stood, how she had spoken, how she had remained steady when everything around her had not as he exhaled slowly, the breath deeper this time, more deliberate, as if he was letting something go, not the moment, not the mistake, but the version of it he had been holding on to before understanding what it truly meant. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, unchanged, and as he finally turned toward the table, reaching for a report form, his movements slower, more intentional, there was no urgency in them, no rush to move past what had happened, only the quiet recognition that some moments do not end when they are over. They stay, shaping what comes next in ways that cannot be undone. The pen felt heavier than it should have as Officer Ryan Walker pulled the report form closer, the paper smooth beneath his fingers, untouched, waiting, while the room around him slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, officers shifting, chairs moving softly, low voices beginning again at the edges, but none of it reached him the same way as before as he sat down, his posture straight, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes fixed on the blank lines in front of him like they held more than just space for words. He picked up the pen, rolling it once between his fingers before lowering it to the page, the tip hovering just above the surface as he paused, not because he did not know what to write, but because he understood now that how he wrote it mattered in a way it had not before. The fluorescent light above cast a pale glow across the paper, flattening the lines, making everything look clean, simple, even as the memory behind it was not. He began with the time, the location, the call, each word deliberate, each sentence measured, his handwriting steady but slower than usual, as if each detail had to pass through something deeper before it could be set down. As he described the gas station, the pump, the position of the vehicle, the initial observation, all the pieces that would normally form a clear, controlled narrative. But this time, the narrative did not feel as solid as it had in the past. He reached the moment where he made the stop, and the pen hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, the tip pressing lightly into the paper, without moving. As the image returned, Naomi Carter standing there, her voice calm, her words simple, her presence steady in a way that now felt louder than anything he had said. He exhaled slowly, then continued, writing what happened, not what he thought happened, not what would make it sound justified, but what actually unfolded, the uncertainty, the lack of confirmation, the decision to proceed anyway. Each word placed carefully, honestly, without trimming the edges. The room behind him shifted slightly, a chair scraping softly, someone clearing their throat, but it stayed distant, like a background he was no longer part of as he moved through the report, reaching the moment where the radio changed, where the tone shifted, where the instruction came through, and his grip on the pen tightened just enough to be felt. He wrote it down exactly as it was, the delay, the hesitation, the command to stand down, the arrival of the vehicles, the presence of the man in the suit, each detail no longer just an event, but a correction, a turning point he had not recognized in time. His handwriting slowed again as he reached the part where the cuffs were removed, the small metallic sound echoing in his memory, quieter now, but heavier, and he paused, not because he did not know what came next, but because this was the moment that had changed everything. Not when the SUVs arrived, not when the radio shifted, but when he realized, even if only for a second, that he had been wrong. He wrote that down too, not as a statement, not as a conclusion, but in the way the moment unfolded, the release, the acknowledgement, the shift in posture, the silence that followed as his pen moved steadily across the page, the words forming a record that no longer belonged to assumption, but to fact. When he reached the end, he did not stop immediately, his hand resting there, the pen still touching the paper as he read back what he had written, each line holding more weight than it would have before, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. He set the pen down slowly, the small sound of it meeting the table clear in the quiet around him as he leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the report, not looking away, not pushing it aside. Across the room, the senior officer moved near the door, speaking quietly with another officer, his presence still steady, still controlled, but no longer centered on Walker as the moment shifted away from instruction and into consequence. Walker placed his hand flat against the paper for a second, feeling the slight texture beneath his palm, grounding himself in something real, something finished, even if the meaning of it was not. The memory returned again, not sharp this time, not pressing, but present. Naomi standing under that light, her gaze steady, her voice calm, saying nothing more than she needed to, and yet it carried more than anything he had said in response. He closed his eyes briefly, just a second, then opened them again, the room coming back into focus, the lights, the table, the quiet movement around him, all of it the same as before, and yet not. He lifted the report, holding it carefully, not loosely, not tightly, just with intention as he stood, his chair sliding back softly against the floor, and walked toward the front of the room, his steps measured, unhurried, each one carrying the weight of what had been written, not just on the page, but in him as well. The senior officer glanced up as Walker approached, his eyes moving briefly to the report, then back to Walker's face, reading something there without needing to ask. As Walker extended the paper, his hand steady, his gaze level, not avoiding, not explaining, just offering it as it was. The senior officer took it, his fingers brushing the edge lightly, then nodded once, a small, controlled motion that did not close the moment, but acknowledged it as Walker stepped back slightly, the the space between them widening again, not in distance, but in understanding as the fluorescent lights above continued their quiet hum, steady, unchanged, illuminating a room where something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to be felt in every quiet breath that followed. The room did not return to normal after the report changed hands. It only appeared to, like a surface settling while something deeper remained in motion as Officer Ryan Walker stepped back from the table, the space around him opening slightly, not empty, but quieter, as if the center of gravity had shifted somewhere else while the senior officer glanced down at the report, flipping the first page with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes scanning the lines without urgency, without interruption, reading not just the words, but the intent behind them as the soft rustle of paper became the loudest sound in the room for a moment. Walker stood still, his hands now resting loosely behind his back, his posture composed, but no longer rigid, his gaze fixed somewhere just past the table, not avoiding, not confronting, simply present as the fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, casting a consistent glow that flattened shadows and made everything look clear, even when it was not. Across the room, a coffee machine clicked softly as it cycled off, the faint scent of burnt grounds drifting into the air, mixing with the quiet tension that had not fully dissipated as a few officers shifted their weight, their conversations held back, their attention still anchored to the front of the room where the report was being read. The senior officer paused briefly at one section, his finger resting lightly against the page as if marking something unseen, then continued, turning another page with the same measured control as Walker felt the moment stretch, not uncomfortably, but with purpose, like something was being allowed to settle fully before moving forward. He did not rush it. He did not need to. The truth was already there. When the senior officer reached the final page, he lowered the report slightly, his eyes lifting from the paper to Walker, holding there for a moment that felt longer than it was, not as judgment, not as approval, but as recognition of what had been written, what had been acknowledged without being softened or reshaped. He closed the report carefully, aligning the edges with a quiet precision, then set it down on the table with a soft, controlled motion that carried more weight than the action itself. "This is accurate," he said, his voice calm, steady, not raised, but firm in a way that filled the space without effort as Walker gave a small nod, the acknowledgement simple, without defense, without explanation. The senior officer studied him for a second longer, then shifted his stance slightly, his posture easing just enough to signal that something had moved, something had been processed. "You will remain on duty," he continued, the words measured, deliberate, "but you will also attend review training starting tomorrow morning." The instruction landed without resistance, without surprise, as Walker nodded again, slower this time, the understanding already there before the words were spoken. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice even, grounded in something quieter than before, something that did not need to assert itself to be heard. The senior officer gave a small nod in return, then turned slightly, his attention moving away from Walker and back toward the room, signaling that the moment had shifted, that the focus was no longer singular, though its impact remained. The low murmur of voices began to return, cautious at first, then steadier, as the officers around the table resumed their positions, their movements controlled, their expressions thoughtful, as if each of them carried a piece of what had just unfolded, even if they did not speak it aloud. Walker remained where he was for a second longer, his eyes drifting briefly to the report on the table, then away, not needing to read it again, not needing to confirm what was already clear as he turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the door, the hallway beyond visible through the narrow window, the same corridor he had walked through minutes earlier, but now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. He took a step forward, then another, his movement steady, unhurried, as he reached for the door and pulled it open, the familiar sound of the hinge cutting softly through the room as the hallway air met him again, cooler, quieter, carrying the faint echo of distant movement. He stepped out, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving the room intact, the conversation continuing without him as he paused for a brief second in the hallway, his eyes adjusting to the slightly dimmer light, the long stretch of corridor extending ahead, unchanged, waiting. He did not rush forward. He did not hesitate. He simply stood there for a moment, breathing evenly, the rhythm of it steady, controlled, as the memory returned again, not as a sharp image, not as a sudden thought, but as something settled, something integrated. Naomi Carter standing under that harsh light, her calm unbroken, her voice measured, her presence steady in a way that had not needed to demand anything to be understood. Walker exhaled slowly, then began to walk, his steps quiet against the floor, each one carrying a weight that was no longer heavy, but deliberate, as if he was choosing them now in a way he had not before, as if the path ahead was not just something to follow, but something to consider with each movement forward while the fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, unchanged, illuminating a hallway that looked the same as it always had, even as the person walking through it no longer was. The hallway stretched ahead in quiet symmetry, each overhead light casting the same pale glow, each step echoing just enough to be heard, but not enough to be remembered, as Officer Ryan Walker moved forward without urgency, his pace steady, his posture composed, no longer driven by the sharp edges of reaction, but guided by something quieter, something that had settled deeper than instruction, while the faint hum of the building followed him, constant, familiar, yet different now, like a sound he had heard his whole life, but was only beginning to notice. He passed the front desk again, the officer there glancing up briefly, offering the same nod as before, but this time Walker returned it with a slight pause, a moment longer than routine required, not out of hesitation, but out of presence, as if the smallest exchanges now carried more weight than they had earlier in the night. The glass doors ahead reflected his movement as he approached, his outline clear against the dim exterior beyond, and when he pushed them open, the cool air outside met him immediately, carrying the faint scent of the night, of asphalt and distance, of a world that continued regardless of what had just unfolded inside. He stepped out onto the pavement, the door closing behind him with a soft finality, and for a moment, he did not move further. He just stood there, the quiet settling around him, the distant sound of traffic low and constant, the sky above dark and open, offering nothing but space. His patrol car sat where he had left it, unchanged, waiting, its surface reflecting the overhead lights in soft lines that shifted slightly as he moved closer, his hand reaching out to rest briefly on the roof, the metal cool beneath his palm, grounding, real. He did not get in right away. Instead, he looked out across the lot, his gaze unfocused, not searching for anything specific, just allowing the moment to exist without trying to shape it, without trying to resolve it too quickly. The memory came back, not sharply, not forcefully, but clearly, Naomi Carter standing under that harsh fluorescent light, her posture steady, her voice calm, her presence unshaken in a space that had not offered her that same steadiness. And this time, the memory did not come with tension, it came with understanding, quiet and complete. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him evenly, without resistance, as if something inside had finally aligned with what he now knew to be true. After a second, he opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar interior surrounding him once again, the faint scent of the earlier drive still present, the dashboard lights coming to life as he turned the key, the engine starting with a low, steady hum that filled the space just enough to remind him where he was. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, not gripping, just resting, his fingers relaxed, his posture steady as he looked forward through the windshield, the road ahead lit by the soft glow of the headlights, stretching out into the night with the same quiet certainty it always had. But something was different. Not the road, not the car, not the job, just the way he saw it now. He shifted the car into drive and eased forward, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement. As he moved out of the lot and onto the street, the motion fluid, controlled, each turn measured, each decision intentional as the streetlights passed overhead one by one, casting brief moments of light across his face, across his hands, across the path ahead. There was no urgency in his driving now, no rush to reach a destination, only a steady progression forward, the kind that allowed space for thought, for reflection, for something deeper than reaction. As he drove, the radio remained quiet, no calls breaking through, no instructions demanding immediate action, just the low hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road. And in that quiet, The weight of the night settled into something that no longer felt heavy, only present. He reached an intersection and slowed, the red light ahead glowing steady, unchanging, and he stopped, the car idling softly as he rested his foot on the brake, his gaze fixed ahead, the empty cross street stretching out in both directions, silent, waiting. For a moment, everything was still. Then the light shifted, red to green. A simple change, expected, routine, and he moved forward, the car responding smoothly, carrying him through the intersection and into the next stretch of road without hesitation. The world had not changed. The system had not changed. The night had not changed. But something inside him had, something small, something quiet, something that would not announce itself but would remain, shaping the way he saw, the way he listened, the way he chose. And as the road continued ahead, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of his headlights, one thought settled into place, not loud, not forced, just clear, like it had always been there waiting to be understood. He had enforced the law, but she had shown him what justice feels like.